Hi, folks. I'm a little late this night. You're seeing Bonnie in the background as she gets settled. I'm sorry. Hi, Dolores. Please do share. I haven't had much time to do it myself. I will do a few things before. I will do a few things before I start to talk. So, okay, please do share as widely as you can. I am now going to start. Hi, Steve Wolfbrand. And Steve says, so what you got, Doc? I got what is real fiscal responsibility tonight, Steve. And what do you got? Anyway, please share. Okay, as much as you can. I'm going to start with real fiscal responsibility now. It'll take me just a second. There we go. So what is real fiscal responsibility? First, let's get to a few definitions. Fiscal sustainability is the capability of a government to keep on spending without reducing its capability to spend. For a fiat sovereign government like the United States, whose capability to issue currency, by currency I mean Fed reserves, paper currency, and also coins, is constitutionally unlimited, and one whose fiscal, by legislation, places no self-constraints on this ability, has made its currency non-convertible to any other commodity or currency, has no debts in foreign currencies, and allows the price of its own currency to float in international trading. There's literally no fiscal sustainability issue for such a government, such as the United States, because its capability to keep on spending can never be diminished. And now we get to real fiscal responsibility shortly. Real fiscal responsibility is a pattern of fiscal policy intended to achieve public purposes, such as full employment, price stability, a first-class educational system, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, while also maintaining or increasing fiscal sustainability, viewed as the extent to which patterns of government spending do not undermine the capability of the government in question to continue to spend to achieve its public purposes. So it's about fulfilling these purposes and maintaining or increasing the capability of the government to continue to spend to achieve its public purposes. Real fiscally responsible policy, if it works generally as expected, creates greater real benefits, not monetary benefits so much, real benefits, greater real benefits than real costs for people. In other words, in terms of both psychic benefits and material benefits, if the government is running real fiscally responsible policy, both of those categories, of benefits will be greater than real costs in these categories for people. So it's that simple. But notice, there is no mention in these definitions, no implication in these definitions that the kinds of things being called fiscal responsibility by politicians, there's no indication that those things have any relation to the definitions I just put forward. And those are common sense definitions. So why is it? Oh, I'm sorry. There was another line I failed to read. It has nothing to do, real fiscally responsible policy has nothing to do with conforming to some standard, simple financial measure like an, quote, acceptable, unquote, debt to GDP ratio that has only a questionable theoretical connection to the actual well-being, of people. It also doesn't have anything to do with some acceptable but national debt level that has only a questionable theoretical connection to the actual of people. It also has nothing to do per se with some specific deficit level that has only a tenuous theoretical connection to the actual well-being, of people. Yet, our politicians want us to believe that fiscal responsibility is about lowering the debt to GDP ratio. They want us to believe it's about cutting the deficit. They want us to believe that over time, it's about reducing the national debt. And when they talk about fiscal responsibility, they never talk about things that are part of the public purpose. They never talk about goods and services that people need. They never talk about levels of living that people need or quality of life that people need. They never talk about clean water. They never talk about clean air. They never talk about climate change. They never talk about anything related to those things. So it is political, fiscal, and economic malpractice to give greater priority to that kind of abstraction. In other words, the debt to GDP ratio, the level of the national debt, and so on, than to full employment, price stability, a strong social safety net, and government programs that will help us solve the many outstanding problems of our nation and our time. Let's put an end to the domination of Washington by that kind of malpractice. Let's put an end to proposals like, for example, Obama's misguided, fiscally irresponsible campaign to promote a, quote, green bargain, unquote. That did nothing but destroy more private sector money and jobs than would have been the case if he either did nothing or increased the deficit in order to create a full employment situation. Austerity requiring budget surpluses cannot work in the United States economy because surpluses, defined as tax revenue exceeding spending, destroy net financial assets in the private sector. Why? Because surpluses are there because taxing exceeds government spending, thereby taking net financial assets out of the private sector. Unless these net financial assets are replaced through revenues acquired by running a trade surplus, perhaps, the continuous loss of financial assets by the private sector is unsustainable. It will eventually lead to credit bubbles, recession or depression, and the return of deficit spending. That's exactly what happened in 2008 and 9. It's exactly what has happened when we suddenly encountered the COVID pandemic and when business activity had to scale back in the United States. At that point, we had the return to even higher deficits than we had before. Note, quote, it is mathematically impossible for the United States to simultaneously run a government surplus, have a trade deficit, that is a current account deficit, and increase aggregate non-government sector financial wealth, unquote. And I have a hat tip here to ENS, who in a comment on a blog I did some time ago put forward this very correct statement of the implications of the sectoral balances, an important part, okay, of MMT thinking. Well, how about deficit reduction plans? It is fiscally irresponsible to frame and follow a long-term deficit reduction plan, a limited austerity plan, when both a trade deficit and an output gap exists. What's an output gap? An output gap is the gap between the economic potential and the economic reality created by following a long-term deficit reduction plan. Why? Because such a plan is one that must remove more money from the economy than would otherwise be the case. Every year, the plan is pursued. And eventually, if pursued for long enough, a declining rate of addition to net financial assets will exacerbate the output gap by lowering aggregate demand and causing both labor and capital to deteriorate, thus reducing the productive capacity of the economy and the government's ability to sustain greater levels of deficit spending, but producing outputs of real social value without triggering inflation. What impact does this have on Social Security and Medicare? Social Security has no solvency or running out of money problems. Yes, I know they say the trust fund is running out, but the trust fund only counts if we wanted to, because the trust fund is not a real bank account. It's just an accounting record. The Social Security crisis is a phony one. No solution to this, quote, fiscal crisis, unquote, bipartisan or partisan, is needed. What is needed is a solution to the political problem of getting Social Security's funding guaranteed in perpetuity by Congress, just the way it guarantees funding for Medicare Parts B and D. It's a question of the language in the Social Security Act. That has to be changed. It's a minor change, but that has to be changed to guarantee congressional appropriations in perpetuity for Social Security programs. The same applies to the so-called Medicare crisis. It too is phony. It can be solved easily by Congress guaranteeing funding in perpetuity to Medicare Parts A and C. Congress has already done that for Parts B and D. Why not for Parts A and C? That's historical accident. More generally, there is no entitlement funding crisis in the United States, except a political crisis where U.S. politicians are determined to ignore their constituents and cut back on an already inadequate safety net, either because they believe in or want others to believe in false ideas about fiscal responsibility and the government as a giant household. Well, the Austerians say will be Greece or maybe Ireland. But Greece and Ireland are users of the euro. They don't issue the euro. So their supply of euros is always limited. And that's why they can run out of euros. But the United States is the issuer of US dollars. So its supply of dollars is limited only by its desire to create them and its ability to mark up private accounts, private sector bank accounts. That's why it can't become Greece, Ireland, or any other Eurozone country. In addition to taxing and borrowing money, the government including the combined activities of the Congress, the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve, has an unlimited capacity to create money. Furthermore, Treasury bonds are like saving accounts. How so? The government of the United States offers the functional equivalent of interest-bearing savings accounts to investors using usually wealthy individuals, large corporations, and foreign nations. But this is not a necessity. This is just what the government of the United States currently offers. It could offer this functional equivalent of interest-bearing savings accounts to poorer people as well. Right now, it doesn't. In World War II, it did. Savings bonds were very, very popular. People bought all manner of savings bonds. The savings accounts, in this case, are usually called U.S. Treasury securities, and the sum of their face values is called the debt subject to the limit, or more colloquially, the national debt, even though comparable savings accounts in banks are for some reason not called the bank debt. And here I have a hat tip to PG, whose name I will not repeat here, but whom I know because years ago he made this comment on one of my blog posts. To continue, even though they are, from an accounting perspective, liabilities. That is, even though comparable savings accounts in banks, certificates of deposit, for example, are for some reason not called the bank debt, even though they are, from an accounting perspective, liabilities. The Treasury can keep accepting deposits, quote, borrowing money, unquote, and issuing securities if we want it to. There's no limit on this government credit card, even though the Austerians and the so-called fiscal responsibility people in Congress are also ranting on and on about our using the government credit card. But there's no limit on this government, quote, credit card, unquote, just as there is no limit to the deposits a bank can accept. There's no limit to the CDs that a bank is able to issue, is there? Except the one imposed arbitrarily by Congress in the form of the amount of debt subject to the limit, otherwise known as the debt ceiling. So, if the United States does run out of money due to a failure to raise the debt ceiling, to raise the debt limit, it will clearly be the fault of the Congress for refusing to grant further authority to the Treasury to elicit and accept further deposits, also known as refusing to raise the debt ceiling so that the Treasury Department can issue more Treasury securities. And also, if we do run out of money, it will be the fault of the Treasury for refusal to use its legal power to mint 1-ounce platinum coins whose face value may be set by the Secretary. We'll talk about that capability a little later. If these things happen, it will be a case of fiscal irresponsibility. not fiscal unsustainability. Fiscal sustainability for the United States government is always there. The question is whether it refuses to exercise it. Also, there's no limit imposed by foreign nations on our credit card either. Even though it may seem that foreign nations can place a limit on, quote, the national credit card, unquote, by refusing to buy Treasury securities, foreign nations holding dollars basically have a choice between continuing to hold them and earning no income, or earning interest on them, or buying securities. Of course, they could do something else. They could sell off all their Treasury securities, but if they sell off them all, if they're big holders of Treasury securities, and they sell them off at one time, they will flood the market with Treasury securities, and they will get less for their Treasury securities than they paid for them, because the market value of the Treasury securities will decline. So foreign nations, no matter how much in Treasury securities they owe, cannot unload Treasury securities too rapidly. So as long as other nations are exporting to the United States and accepting dollars as payment, those dollars are likely to be invested in the interest-bearing, quote, savings accounts, unquote, known as Treasury securities. Bond markets don't control U.S. interest rates. The Federal Reserve Bank does, by exercising its authority to try to meet its target interest rates. The bond vigilantes have no power against the Fed. If they fight against its interest rate targets by trying to bid them up, then they will, quote, die, unquote, in the flood of reserves the Fed can unleash to drive the interest rates down to its chosen target. The U.S., of course, must pay off its Treasury securities as it falls due. It must pay off its debt instruments. It must pay off its debts. The United States is obligated by Section 4 of the 14th Amendment to pay all its debts as they come due. Nevertheless, our national debt cannot be a burden on our grandchildren unless they wish to make it so by stupidly taxing more than they spend. This is true because assuming the debt ceiling is raised when that is needed or repealed, we have an unlimited credit card to incur new debt at interest rates of our choosing. So we can, quote, roll over, unquote, our national debt indefinitely. Or alternatively, we can create all the money we need to pay off the debt subject to the limit without ever incurring any more debt. The United States can always create the money it needs to meet its obligations. One way to do this is through platinum coin seigniorage. A second way is through Congress ordering the Federal Reserve to use its ability to create money out of thin air to add reserves to the Treasury spending account equal to the amount of its appropriations plus the amount of the amount of principal plus interest on federal debt falling due during the period of the appropriation. I call this overt congressional financing. Okay. A third way to always create money is through subordinating the Fed to the Treasury Department and then having the Treasury order the Fed to create all the reserves necessary to spend appropriations and pay back debt. The first way is legal now. It was made legal by the Coin Act of 1996. The second is constitutional, but requires action by Congress. Congress has to create overt congressional financing by giving the appropriate orders to the Federal Reserve. The third way is constitutional, but it would require politically unlikely action by Congress to authorize it, to mandate it. Congress would basically have to reorganize the executive function by taking the Federal Reserve, which is now an independent agency, and placing it within the Treasury Department. This is easily done by Congress if it wants to. It could probably do it in a single afternoon. But of course, then everybody would talk about what a tragedy it is that the Federal Reserve is no longer independent. If the Federal Reserve, is independent, it's independent due to the will of Congress, because Congress doesn't want to place it inside of the executive branch. Now, there is some question here as to whether Congress had the constitutional right to create an executive function and place it outside of the executive branch of government. There are only supposed to be 3 branches, of government. All 3 were created by the Constitution. But the Federal Reserve, which is serving as an executive branch, not subject to the authority of the president, is a creation of Congress, not a creation of the Constitution. How can it exist? Yet it does, because the Supreme Court has refused to hear any cases questioning the constitutionality of the Federal Reserve based on the separation of powers in the Constitution. In any case, whatever constraints have been placed on the government in relation to creating money are political constraints. They are not financial constraints. There are no financial constraints. How would the Congress create overt congressional financing? Here are the 2 sentences that Congress would need. They can be placed in appropriations bills, in continuing resolution bills, in money bills of all kinds. The first sentence says, it says, upon passage, quote, upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Federal Reserve with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend this appropriation. In addition, this is the second sentence, quote, in addition, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of this appropriation. That's all that's necessary. That can be done anytime Congress passes a money bill. If it becomes boilerplate in every money bill, that's what would happen. There would be no need for the Treasury Department to issue any more Treasury securities. No need unless it had a specific purpose for doing so. There would be no need either to tax people for revenue if this were done. In actual fact, there's no need now to tax people for revenue, because there is a trigger that the Federal Reserve actually uses to create new money for the Treasury spending account. When people pay taxes and the taxes are settled, those tax revenues are destroyed. But the Federal Reserve has a business rule that upon settlement of those taxes through deposits made by the Treasury Department, that new money will be created by the Fed for the Treasury spending account. So going further, real fiscal responsibility is not about deficits or debts or Treasury securities or the levels of those things. It's about public purpose. A fiscal policy that measures its success or failure in reducing deficits rather than by its impacts on public purpose is fiscally irresponsible and politically unsustainable. The deficit is a meaningless measure from the viewpoint of government solvency, because the U.S. government has no limits on its authority to create/spend money other than self-imposed ones. So neither the level of the national debt nor the debt to GDP ratio can affect the government's capacity to spend congressional appropriations at all. Also, a deficit/debt-oriented fiscal policy ignores real outcomes relating to employment, price stability, economic growth, environmental impact, crime rates, civil strife, and violence, etc., which actually can affect fiscal sustainability by strengthening or weakening the underlying economy, and with it, the legitimacy of the federal government and its fiat currency. In other words, the faux fiscal responsibility that our Congress people and our presidents are pursuing now actually weaken the underlying economy, and with it the legitimacy of the government and its fiat currency. That is one reason why I say that that kind of fiscal policy is fiscally irresponsible. Because if there's anything that can affect the fiscal sustainability of the United States, It's destroying the legitimacy of the government because it's perceived as a tyranny that never does anything for the population. In short, responsible fiscal policy is not about its impact on government debt. It's about its impact on people. Government is not like your household. The federal government is not like a household. Households can't make their own currency and require that people use that currency to pay taxes. So, the supply of dollars in our households is always limited. It's even limited in Jeff Bezos' household. While the government's its supply of reserves that it can use to spend is a matter of its decisions alone. However large the federal debt becomes, it cannot be a, quote, crushing burden, unquote, on our government, because federal spending is virtually costless to the government if the government wants it to be that way. Current claims that we have a fiscal crisis must debate the debt, must fix the debt, and must immediately embark on a long-term deficit reduction program to bring the debt to GDP ratio under control. All misconceive the fiscal situation, the monetary realities, and smack of a campaign to create public hysteria. Further, campaigns like that are based on the idea that fiscal responsibility is about developing a plan to bring the debt to GDP ratio, quote, under control, unquote, when fiscal responsibility is really about using government spending to achieve outputs that fulfill, quote, public purpose. There is no fiscal crisis that will require, quote, a grand bargain, unquote, including cuts to popular discretionary spending and entitlement programs. That is a phony fiscal crisis. The only real crises are one of a failing, stagnant economy with growing economic inequality, in which only the needs of the few are served, while the needs of the many are ignored, and also one of lack of political desire or will to solve these problems. MMT policies can help to bring an end to the first economic crisis, but not if the progressives and others continue to believe in false ideas about fiscal sustainability and responsibility and the similarity of their government to a household. Now, it may seem strange, but there are still many progressives who believe in the false ideas about fiscal sustainability and fiscal responsibility that I have called out. They have believed in those ideas for a long time, and in spite of the spread of MMT ideas, which I am happy to see are spreading faster and faster, far too much of the progressive movement is comprised of people who do not understand what our government is capable of when it is run in such a way that it will deficit spend to achieve the public purpose. That is what is necessary. Now, why have I specified an overt congressional financing? Why have I specified that the debt be paid off? If, as I'm telling you, the debt is really not an economic problem. The reason why I do this is because I want to make those progressives and other people realize that the size of the debt and the debt to GDP ratio is not an economic problem, that it's a phony problem, that the debt can be paid off anytime the Congress chooses by just using overt congressional financing in the way that I have specified. The first president who demonstrates, or the first Congress that demonstrates through overt congressional financing that this is true, will be the Congress that, in demonstrating the reduction in the debt, will teach the American people that the debt instruments sold by the federal government are really no problem. No problem at all. And by way of pointing out to you that the good news about the realities of federal financing is now finally beginning to spread, in Congress. And the way to show you that that good news is in fact actually spreading is to show you a video that appeared just a couple of days ago. I will play some of this for you. It's from the Washington Journal. Okay, I'm not going to play the whole thing. It would be a violation of copyright. And furthermore, I don't need to play the whole thing.
As hospitals and
to value add.
You bring change to the patients' lives today. For over, go to cspanshop.org.
Okay, so let's see, where are we here?
Washington Journal continues. Back with us this morning.
Okay, let's go forward with this. Here's a little statement by a fiscal responsibility hawk, specifically Kevin Hearn,
need help, need a handout.
Ways and Means
many of us
committee
in America, myself
member,
included, early on in life, needed that help.
Ways and Means committee member who's a Republican from the state, of Oklahoma. And he answers a question by the host, of the Washington Journal. And this is what he said.
Those who can't help themselves, they need help, need a handout. Many of us in America, myself included, early on in life, needed that help. But we also ought to be helping those folks move on to jobs. And so the American Jobs Plan, as the president has pushed, and the American Family Plan, as you just referenced, American Family Plan is over $4 trillion of spending. The American Jobs Plan that was just pushed forward is over $1.5 trillion. And so when you look at these two programs together, along with some other things going on, we're talking about a $6 trillion budget. And the American taxpayer has just said enough is enough. Even Democrats now are sending letters to the leaders of both the House and the Senate saying, we have got to get our fiscal house in order.
So, Mr. Hearn is saying, our fiscal house is not in order. We are fiscally irresponsible, is what he's implying. And how does he conclude that? He just he just cites the size of the federal budget that is shaping up under Joe Biden. The sheer size of it, the staggering size of it. And he basically raises the question of whether the federal government is able to afford it. So,
Chair Yarmouth, I mean, how can we spend $6 trillion and all the other money that President Biden wants to spend? How can we afford it?
We can't afford it because we determine how much money's in the system and at the federal level. The federal government is not like any other user of currency, not like any household, any business, any state or local government. We issue our own currency. And to the American people, the only constraint being that we do have to worry about inflation from that spending. Now, what so many people say, well, we've got so much debt and our grandchildren are going to have, it's going to be on their backs and so forth. That's not the way it works. And I think the American people need an education about how the monetary system does work. I remember going back to when Paul Ryan was chair of the Budget Committee, and even before that, and all of these forecasts of gloom and...
Okay, so let me stop there for the moment. This is the Budget Committee chair in the House. John Yarmouth is the opposite number in the House of Bernie Sanders in the Senate. The two of them together set the parameters of reconciliation bills. They did this for the American Rescue Plan, and they will do it for any other reconciliation bill that the Democrats try to pass through the Congress. Okay, now Bernie never came out directly with MMT-like statements, even though he's known about MMT, I'm sure, at least since 2013. At least since the time he put Stephanie Kelton on his dream economic team. And certainly when he appointed her as the chief economist of the Budget Committee in 2015. He's known about MMT since then. But he never tried to educate people in the way John Yarmouth was doing right here. I'll continue.
Doom about, we're going to accumulate so much debt and interest rates are going to crowd out all other spending. Well, we basically doubled the national debt from the recession in 2009 until last year before the pandemic. And none of the things that people warned would happen happened. We didn't have inflation. We had record low interest rates rather than higher interest rates. And the dollar was trading within normal levels vis-a-vis other currencies. So I think a lot of economists now have begun to say, wait a minute, maybe we've been thinking about debt in entirely the wrong way. And even Fed Chair Jay Powell has basically said, we have the fiscal space to do what we need to do right now, to make the investments we need to make to build the kind of economy for the future that we all hope we'll have.
Well, why are people wrong about this, and how should we be thinking about debt and deficits?
Well, I don't get any royalties from this, but I would flog a book called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, an economist and professor, and it's become quite a bestseller, actually. And what she says is that if you look at the total national debt, $28 trillion right now is what we think of as the national debt. She said, don't think of it as debt. Think of it as all the money that the federal government has invested in the country over our history minus taxes. And that's really what it is. I mean, those $28 trillion didn't exist before the federal government issued them. And so the federal government has the ability to create create money, create financing, and that's what we've been doing. We'll continue to do. The thing that I am so impressed about from the Biden administration is that they're reversing decades and decades of our asking questions in the wrong order. Historically, what we've always done is said, what can we afford to do? And that's not the right question. The right question is, what do the American people need us to do? And that question becomes the first question. Once you've answered that, then you say, how do you resource that need?
Okay, so John Yarmuth is saying this concerning the Biden administration. So what did the Biden administration do? It put forth at first what it thought the country needed. But somewhere in the background, there was this nagging question about what can we afford? So it gets into bipartisan negotiations with the Republicans. And it lets the Republicans frame the issue as being an issue of what we can afford. Because what is the Republicans' real objection? Oh, we know their real objection is they don't want to give Biden a win. But apart from that, what's the public objection? The public objection is we can't afford to spend the $2.2 trillion that Biden first asked for. So it's got to be smaller than that. It's got to be something like $1 trillion with only, what is it, $200 or $300 billion of new money over 10 years? What's their rationalization for saying that? It is that we can't afford it. By negotiating with them on this, Biden is giving way to the frame of we can't afford it. When John Yarmuth, of course, has just told us exactly why we can afford it in very common sense language. So no, I think I disagree with him on that. I don't think the Biden administration is sticking by its guns, okay, of what we need. And even if you thought that when it first came out with its $2.2 trillion request and then the American Families Plan, okay, which is even more than that. I forget the exact figure, but for the American Families Plan. Even then, that plan was being criticized by the Sunrise movements and other part of the Green movement for being far too little. They were pushing the Thrive Act, a $10 trillion plan. And of course, neither of these things compared to Bernie's $16.2 trillion plan that he ran on over 10 years. So in spite of what John Yarmuth is saying here, lurking in the background is that fiscally irresponsible deficit debt type of orientation that still is dragging us down so we can't get what we need. Let's go a little further into what John Yarmuth has to say.
And that's not just money, that's also capacity. So, for instance, there's a 200.
So what John just said, he was talking about we decide on what we need, and then we decide on how we resource it. That, of course, is MMT language. But deficit, what Stephanie was talking about, okay, in the deficit, what she's talking about, okay, in the deficit myth there, is we decide how to put together the real resources we need to fulfill our needs. She's talking about the real resources. But by not emphasizing the real resources here, but John Yarmouth is being a little vague about things. People can misinterpret what he's saying. Is first we decide what we need, and then we decide how to resource it in terms of money. But that's not what John Yarmouth is saying. He is saying we have to figure out how to resource it in terms of people, in terms of materials, in terms of skills, in terms of things like that. He's not at all contending that there's any government in providing the financial resources that might be needed, however large they might be.
$125 billion investment in child care in the American Families Plan. But you can't just say we're going to give $225 billion to people to pay for their child care because there's not enough capacity. So what you do is you make a false promise to the people, and then you drive the price of existing child care even higher. So what you have to do is spend part of that money on building capacity so that there's enough child care to actually service the people who need it. So again, they're just very different ways of thinking about money, and I understand why most people don't understand this concept, because they think of it in their own framework, which is their household, which is you can't borrow so much money that you can't pay back. But that's not the position that the federal government's in.
Congressman, are you saying we can just print more money and there's no consequences?
There could be consequences if there is too much inflation. So let me give you a hypothetical. We could say that we're going to give every American family a $200,000 voucher to buy a house. We could create the money to do that. But what would happen? Well, there's not enough housing, so the prices of existing houses would go through the roof, no pun intended. And again, you'd be creating a false promise, but meanwhile, you drive up the housing market to unsustainable levels. So there is a limit as to how much money we can inject into the economy. The thing about the rescue plan, and here's where I think Kevin Hearn makes a mistake, is he said $6 trillion American Families Plan and Job Plan. It's not quite that much, but that's over 8 to 10 years. So the $6 trillion budget that the president proposed actually would have been $5.7 trillion if you had no American Jobs Plan or American Rescue Plan, because only $300 billion of that is in fiscal year 22. So again, you've got to realize these are numbers that are very large, of course, but they're spread out over a number of years. And that's why I think the Fed chair and others have said we have the fiscal space to do this, because injecting this over a period of time will not cause the kind of inflation that is dangerous.
Respond to.
So, $6 trillion over 10 years, only $600 billion a year. Nowhere near the full size of the federal budget. Nowhere near that at all. Okay. In a very short period of time, I guess I finished the Kevin Hearn part of the clip at somewhere around 2 minutes or so. So in roughly 5 minutes, what John did there was to begin to educate people about real financial funding facts for the federal government. He did it in common sense terms. He was fairly relaxed about it. He wasn't hysterical about it. He put the MMT position when it comes to policy very, very well. It's significant that he is the first committee chair in Congress. The powerful people in Congress are the committee chairs. He is the first committee chair to do that. That's why this is something of a milestone. And his position that he stated here, that is a real fiscally responsible position. He was embodying real fiscal responsibility there. You heard it through him. What you heard from Kevin Hearn was what I call faux fiscal responsibility, F-A-U-X, faux fiscal responsibility, false fiscal responsibility, which our government has been following, defending, and advocating faux fiscal responsibility for lo these many years. I think what we need to do, almost the most important thing we can do right now, over the next few months, over the next year, is to take that label of fiscal responsibility away from them and make it our own. Because what John Yarmuth is talking about here is the essence of real fiscal responsibility, not some completely non-relevant stuff tied to an abstract statistic like the debt to GDP ratio and the size of the national debt. Those abstractions are not important to the everyday life of people. The real effects of government deficit spending, that's what can bring a real improvement to the lives of people in the United States. So, that's what I wanted to say about real fiscal responsibility today. Hi there, Aaron Taylor. It's been a long time. Happy to see you. I did want to go ahead with two other things that I want to cover tonight. First, something about the climate. Really important, from Common Dreams. 115 degrees on Jones Boulevard in Las Vegas, Nevada. The Southwest is being baked now, or has been being baked. Surreal, and distressing climate experts' predictions come true with U.S. heat wave. It's by Jessica Corbett on June 18th. Is what the National Weather Service described as dangerous and record-breaking heat affects 50 million people across the western United States, even before the first day of summer. And among those 50 million people is my daughter. Climate experts and activists are using the hot conditions to reiterate warnings and calls for policy change as scientists are seeing their dire predictions come true. Quote, the current heat wave and drought leave no doubt we are living the dangerous effects of the climate crisis. Tom Steyer tweeted that on Friday. Quote, action is urgently needed. Steyer shared a Thursday New York Times report on the extreme heat that also caught the attention of Campaign for Nature director Brian O'Donnell, who warned that in the absence of bold action to address the climate emergency, quote, this will all get much worse, unquote. Extreme heat, drought, and wildfires are all happening now in my hometown of Durango, Colorado. This will all get much worse if we don't hashtag act on climate and prioritize climate change as the emergency that it is. I'm going to go even further and say those 50 million people who are subject right now to the extremes, of climate change, they need to demand action on the Green New Deal right now. They need to demand it with urgency, because in not taking action to help them and the other residents of the United States, the government of the United States is endangering the Union. Its lack of action is today endangering 50 million people in the southwest of the United States and in the far west of the United States. If the federal government will not take action on behalf of those people, what ought they to do? What ought they to do? The most important function of the federal government is to keep the people safe. That is why it is there. Insofar as it is not taking action to limit the climate emergency, it is threatening the lives of us all. And I don't care if it's Joe Manchin who's failing to take action. I don't care if it's Joe Biden who's failing to take action. I don't care if it's Chuck Schumer who's failing to take action. I don't care who is failing to take action. We need these Green New Deal bills passed. We need to get going on combating climate change. If the filibuster stands in the way, we need to get rid of the filibuster. If certain senators stand in the way because they must have bipartisanship, we need to do whatever it takes to get rid of those senators. We don't have time any longer to fool around. O'Donnell's ominous warning was echoed by Daniel Swain, the Colorado-based climate scientist at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at the University of California, Los Angeles. Quote, "We're still a long way out from the peak of the wildfire season and the peak of the dry season," unquote, he told the Times. "Things are likely to get worse before they get better," unquote. And the conditions in the south, the U.S. West, quote, "A heat dome is baking Arizona and also Nevada, where temperatures have soared over past 115 degrees this week, and doctors are warning that people can get third-degree burns from the sizzling asphalt. At Lake Mead, which supplies water for 25 million people in 3 southwestern states and Mexico, the water levels have plunged to their lowest point since the reservoir was filled in the 1930s. In California, farmers are abandoning their thirstiest crops to save others, and communities are debating whether to ration tap water. In Texas, electricity grids are under strain as residents crank their air conditioners, with utilities begging customers to turn off appliances to help avert blackouts. In Arizona, Montana, and Utah, wildfires are blazing. As National Weather Service John Salmon put it to the Associated Press while discussing temperatures in and around Las Vegas that are expected to continue this weekend, This is pretty impressive. We're seeing all-time records fall. And amid the current heat event, the updated drought monitor was released today. D3, D4 conditions persist across the Bay Area and much of northern and central California. This is from NWS, the Bay Area. And there's a map of not simply the Bay Area, but very much of the Southwest, going as far as New Mexico. All of those states, up through Oregon and Washington as well, are all being victimized by this heat event. The government of the United States has done nothing to protect them from these kinds of events. Swain told The Guardian, the most distressing part is that this is very much in line with predictions. Climate scientists have been repeating essentially the same messages and warnings since before I was born, unquote. Actually, since the 1960s. Catherine Hayhoe, a Texas-based climate expert, chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, responded similarly in comments to the newspaper. I'm not going to read the rest of these comments. You're getting the point. I've already made the point. So Senator Heinrich says this is why it's past due to act on climate. There's an article in The Guardian which is cited there. Writing Wednesday for The Intelligencer, David Wallace Wells, author of The Uninhabitable Earth, outlined what this summer could look like in California, which has seen some devastating and historic wildfires in recent years and beyond. I'm not going to quote that either. Suffice it to say, it's just bad. So you may want to go to this article and read the rest of it. He says, I personally know probably a dozen people in California, maybe 20, who have had to personally outrun flames. So, as Common Dreams reported Wednesday, the high comes as negotiations in the White House and Congress over an infrastructure package drag on, and the conditions in the U.S. West are bolstering by lawmakers and activists on the progressive side in their position of, quote, no climate, no deal, unquote. So there it is. You get the point. It's a simple point. One last article. This one by David Sirota, one of our very favorites here. This is an article about a coming crisis that may require cram down, which, however, is not here. Dems didn't aid struggling homeowners in 2008. Trump reaped the rewards. This is by David Sirota alone. On June 15th. And when Americans started facing the threat of foreclosure at the height of the 2008 financial crisis, Obama campaigned on a promise of a simple, straightforward, and elegant solution. Force big banks to accept some losses and write down the amounts homeowners owned on their mortgages, thereby avoiding mass foreclosures. Soon after winning office, he abandoned the pledge, to the delight of his Wall Street donors. Betrayal, straight off getting into the presidency. Now, new data suggests that had Democrats instead used their huge congressional majorities to deliver relief, they could have rescued hundreds of thousands of families who were thrown out of their homes while Obama's administration was bailing out the banks. Separate data, meanwhile, suggests that lessening the blow of the housing crisis on middle-class families may have averted Donald Trump's narrow victory in 2016. May have averted. The data provides a powerful cautionary tale to President Biden and congressional Democrats as financial analysts have warned of the possibility of a significant increase in foreclosures this year. Cramdown could have stopped 600,000 foreclosures. The new study evaluates so-called mortgage cramdown, whereby bankruptcy judges reduce outstanding home loan debts in order to keep people in their homes. Supreme Court restricted the procedure in 1993, leaving judges unable to use cramdown to reduce the debts of middle-class Americans on their primary residences, even though judges were free to keep using cramdown to shield wealthy people's investment properties and vacation homes from creditors. Comparing data from courts that had previously used cramdown with courts that did not use cramdown, the analysis from researchers at the University of Minnesota, the University of Texas, and PUC Chile finds that cramdown, quote, reduces the 5-year foreclosure rate by 29 percentage points, stabilizes living arrangements and circumstances of households, unquote, and is associated with a reduction in crime rates. In early 2009, Obama's incoming administration pledged to, quote, reduce mortgage payments for economically stressed but responsible homeowners while also reforming our bankruptcy laws, and the new administration had recent history as a validator of its pro-cramdown plans. When the federal government extended cramdown to rescue family farmers in the 1980s, it had the effects of compelling lenders to preemptively write down the mortgage principal to avert bankruptcy proceedings, according to Federal Reserve Bank research. But after Wall Street banks that bankrolled Obama's campaign mounted a furious lobbying blitz, the White House quickly backed down, and Democratic lawmakers said Obama officials abandoned the effort, dooming it to defeat. And Dick Durbin said in 2009, quote, the banks are to believe in a time when we're facing a banking crisis that many of the banks created are still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and they frankly own the place, quote. Dick Durbin said this after a failed Senate effort to pass cramdown in 2009, which was an effort, by the way, that by that time no longer had the support of the administration because they had backed off. Between 2007 and the end of Obama's first term, banks foreclosed on more than 4 million households who were unable to use cramdown in the same way corporations and wealthy investors can use the provision to shield their own property. So they let the wealthy people do that. They prohibited middle-class people from doing that. Everybody who voted against that bill in 2009, if they're still in the Senate, should be immediately defeated in the next election. Researchers conservatively estimate that cramdown may have prevented roughly 600,000 foreclosures and maybe significantly more. Trump ended up turning the foreclosure disaster into a huge political opportunity for himself, increasing Republican electoral support in areas that were particularly hard hit by the housing crisis. This is according to data compiled by the Center for American Progress. Quote, Larger proportions of underwater homeowners were prominent features of counties where support for the Republican Party increased from 2012 to 2016, compared with the Democratic Party, with where the Democratic Party gained or maintained a foothold in 2016, unquote. CAP's analysis found, quote, in addition to declines among suburban and rural voters, Democrats experienced shrinking margins of victory in several distressed metro areas. This may have played a role in turning Michigan and Wisconsin from blue to red in the 2016 presidential election. I wonder how many foreclosures occurred in Detroit as a result of not being able to use cram down. David Sirota points out cram down is still not on the books during COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of homeowners have taken advantage of mortgage forbearance programs to put off home payments. Though that has stemmed the tide of foreclosures for now, recent data shows an uptick in new foreclosure proceedings. Recent analysis by the Fed estimated, quote, current forbearance programs may prevent about 500,000 foreclosures that otherwise would have occurred last year. Almost exactly the number of foreclosures that the new cram-down research said would have been prevented during the last housing meltdown. In response, the Democratic lawmakers included what some considered a limited version of cram-down in a COVID-related spending package signed by Trump at the very end of 2020. The provisions allow for more bankruptcy protections and discharge debts, even if debtors miss some mortgage payments on a residential home, as long as the missed payments were related to hardship incurred by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, those protections are temporary and end later this year. At the end of 2020, Elizabeth Warren introduced a bill to reinstate cram-down. As a bankruptcy law professor, she was one of the most outspoken voices for the policy. However, the legislation has not yet been reintroduced in the new Congress. Great piece by David Sirota, pointing to another crisis that is coming unless this government finds a way to act, which it is not doing right now. Okay, on to your questions. On to your questions, which I will now consider. So, Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, my friend Dolores, a beautiful magic woman. Okay, and Dolores says, hi, everyone. Dale Weaver says, good evening, all. Steve Wolfbrand says, sharing. And Kay says, hi, everybody. Finally found you, laugh out loud. Kay, I sent you directly an invitation tonight by messenger. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Kay. Steve Gunn says, I meant to say, Joe Manchin is the Strom Thurmond of Joe Biden's. Kay says, shared. Steve says, one guy with balls controlling the Senate. Too bad the squad doesn't have his balls. Steve, they better have grown some in the last couple of months, because I can't believe their fundraising has not been hurt by the force the vote debacle. Ghost Art says, hello, peers. Hashtag shared. Kay says, I think they're working on it. Lana says, hi, folks. Steve Wolfbrand says, subscribe to the Breaking Points? Yes, I have. Kay says, already did, Steve Wolfbrand. Steve Gonzalez is celebrating Juneteenth. Even had 2 friends visits today. Steve Wolfbrand says Texas definitely owes them 2 years reparations. They fucking lied to them. Jeffrey Denton says, this is where we come into the part where both parties are complicit about it, therefore conspiring against Americans and committing treason. So Steve says, hello, Jeffrey. Jeffrey says, hi, Steve. Joe's telling it like it is. Steve says, he's very cool, but sometimes very wrong. Overall, I do love this guy. Thank you, Steve. Steve over that case says, I got savings bonds when I worked at the old mental hospital years ago. Was it mental hospital or mental hospital? Steve Wolfbrand says, banks don't give you shit anymore. I deposited $70,000. They gave me $100. Whoop-de-doo. Steve, how about a credit union? KRTD Media says, hi, Joe. Hi, Shane. How you doing? I'm sure that's Shane. Steve Wolfbrand says, if we can cancel student debt, couldn't we just cancel national debt? Hey, Shane, are we live streaming tonight successfully to KRTD Media? Because if we're not, there was something wrong with the stream key. Okay. Kay says, good question, Steve Wolfbrand. Steve says, do you have any idea how many people are living in tents in the streets? It's endless. Same in most big cities. This is gross. We're worse than third world, they counted in the census. We got Hoovervilles back. They're Hoovervilles. Joe Biden has Hoovervilles in his administration. And he can say that Trump is responsible for the Hoovervilles, but Obama is just as responsible for the Hoovervilles. Biden has to get rid of the Hoovervilles. Joe Biden, look at Bernie's housing program. Steve says, they aren't counted. They aren't counted in the census. Kay says, we have become a third world country in too many ways. And Lana Dell says, oh yes, awesome C-SPAN video. Steve Gonzo says, what's next, natives? Steve Gonzo says, 1/6 proved they're not even fiscally responsible. 1 out of 6? 1/6? I mean, 95% of them are not fiscally responsible. Kay says John Yarmouth is from Kentucky too. Yes, he is. Steve Wolfbrand says the homeless problem in LA is actually genocide, equal to Nazi concentration camps. 70 left to die. This is disgusting. In 115-degree heat. I don't know if it's 115 degrees K in LA, but I'll bet it's pretty damn hot. Steve Manzo says, go, John by Yarmouth, go. Hashtag by represent MMT. Steve says, homelessness is genocide of the poor. It is. Kay says, but yes, it is. Steve Wolfbrand. Steve Gonzo says, the debt ceiling is falling. The debt ceiling is falling. Steve Gonzo says, actually, there is enough housing. They just won't let people get into the housing. Steve Gonzo says, give me a 200,000 voucher and I'll show you. Okay, and Aaron Taylor says, wow, amazing. Jeffrey Denton says, I'll take a 600 million contract to spy on my fellow Americans like they just give anybody. $600 million contract to spy on my fellow Americans like they just give anybody. And it won't even be fascism or a monopoly that doesn't even have any competition, just like Zuckerberg and Gates and Musk and Bezos. You know, the squad, quote unquote. Just ordinary citizens with government grants that just anyone can get, all fair and equal. Ghostdot says, introducing hashtag MMT representative John Yarmouth. Ghostdot says, KRTD in the house. Kay says, my granddaughters are out in California too. Oh, before I forget, but let me remind you that on Monday, KRTD Media is going to start to rebroadcast some of my YouTubes between 10 a.m. and 12 a.m. in the morning, ET, each day. Each day. I will be looking in on some of those the live streams, and we'll be making comments in the comment stream. Kay says, so glad I got out of Arizona a couple of years ago. Yeah, boy, I'm glad you got out of there too, Kay. That I'm sure today it is awful in Arizona. Steve Gonzo says there'll be enough people on the street to affect change soon. Kay says, I hope so, Steve Gonzo. Steve Gonzo says, oops, sorry, Kay. Reply to all. I'll laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo says, excuse me, it's what's up, Doc? Steve Gonzo says, hashtag OCF. Hashtag OCF indeed. It's time that hashtag OCF went viral. Lana says, hi, Aaron and Steve. Gina Marie says, hi, everyone. Hi, Gina Marie. And Lana Dell says, the lenders hate cram down for obvious reasons. Tough tortillas. Can it be done outside the BK court? I don't think it can be done outside of the bankruptcy court. But in the context of the bankruptcy court, it crams it down, and but I don't think it actually puts the bankruptcy through. In other words, it gives relief to the mortgage holders so they don't have to go through bankruptcy. But I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that's how it works, but that would be logical. If you cram down sufficiently so they can stay in their homes, that probably means that they get a sufficient amount of relief that they can continue to carry their mortgages. Steve Gonzo says, necessity breeds contempt. Steve Gonzo says, I got 1 million of them. Kay says, Bank of America kept raising our insurance rates even though we never had a claim. Turns out we were paying for beach homes who were rentals and never prepped for hurricanes. Shake my head. One of the worst banks there is. Steve Gonzo says, ought to be a law, hashtag misappropriation of funds. Indeed. Belana says, oh my God, hashtag Hoovervilles. Steve Gonzo, okay, I didn't know this was in the form of a question. How do you spell fecally, as in fecal responsibility? Hashtag January 6th. Very clever, Steve Gonzo. Very clever. Steve Gonzo says, hashtag shut up, I'm drunk. Okay, and Lana says, I didn't like Arizona 30 years ago. There is no water there. It gets piped in from the Colorado River. It's cold in Minnesota, but there are 11,000 lakes here and the Mississippi River. Lana says, no, familiarity breeds contempt. And necessity is the mother of invention. You are mixing these up, Steve. Haha. Yes, he is. Well, I'm glad to see that I have more people here now than I had through most of the live stream. Anyway, thank you for coming. Hey, I'll be seeing you Tuesday, and you'll be seeing me on Monday on KRTD Media. And I am going to look in on the comment stream for those particular broadcasts. I'm going to keep it in the background. And I'll spend some time tomorrow scheduling the videos for the next week, okay, or two. And Kay says, I never liked Arizona either. I went from the swamp back to the desert. Good night. Says Lana, and Dolores says, thank you and good night all. Steve Gonzo says, tonight we the dirty dozen. Thank you, Steve Gonzo, for that bit, okay, of levity. I'm reminded tomorrow is Father's Day. So, good night all. Have a great Father's Day. And a great rest of the weekend. Kay says, thank you for a good discussion. But I love you all. We love you too, Kay. Good night.